So in Generation 4, Scarf was introduced, and it's one of the most important items in competitive Pokemon, just as a whole. So I thought it would be fun to just go through each gen and talk about the most important Scarfers. According to me, it's just my opinion, but my opinion is based on facts, so there is that. So starting with Generation 4, Tyranitar. It was Scarf Tyranitar's world in DPPOU, and we were all just living in it. In Generation 4, when the special physical split happened and Scarf was added, Tyranitar had become even more deadly than in Advanced. Even though Tyranitar has a pretty slow speed stat, Scarf Tyranitar is a staple in the earlier gens, because Tyranitar seemed to counter literally everything. Psychic types in the earlier gens were basically omnipresent and very powerful Pokemon, like Celebi and Latias, but Scarf Tyranitar can now not only outspeed, but use Stab, Pursuit, and Crunch to finish them off. It's not super often that an iconic Scarfer is a slow Pokemon, since usually Scarf is given to usually already fairly fast Pokemon, but Tyranitar seemed to be an exception to that rule, although not the only one. He was particularly great at cleaning up, and even though I'm going to limit the Pokemon I speak about to only one gen, Scarf Tyranitar continued to be a fantastic Scarfer up until Generation 6 and 7. That's about 8 years, since one of the few flaws that he had was again that he was slow. Now with Scarf, that just was no longer the case. Next is Flygon. Flygon is a Pokemon that the overwhelming majority of the time will run Scarf in DPPOU. You usually never know what item a Pokemon is running because usually there are multiple sets, and they'll all be viable to certain degrees. But that's not the case with Flygon. While Flygon can run Specs or Life Orb, Scarf is a very good choice, because that way it can outspeed Pokemon like Jolly Natured Gengar, Infernape, Latias, Starmie, and Zapdos. Ground Dragon is also a great stab typing, and since this is pre-Fairy, and since Garchomp was banned from Generation 4OU, this was a nice way to fill the void on your Pokemon team that Garchomp left. You could go for a special attacker or a physical attacker, and either way Flygon was very menacing. There were a few factors that boosted Flygon's overall viability, like Outrage being boosted, and the physical special split happening, but I believe that Scarf played a big role in it when it comes to Flygon's viability, because at this point he's much more viable than in the generation he was introduced in, which almost never happens, as a Pokemon's viability usually goes down over time. And although that did happen with Flygon, Generation 4 was the peak of his career. Also, he's immune to spikes via Levitate, so that's a lot of fun. Next is the Rotoms. In Generation 4, all the Rotoms have the same typing of Ghost and Electric, the only difference being their signature moves. While they're all ranked OU, Heat and Rosh Rotom are the most popular, and Scarf is a very common set. One very popular strategy is to pair Scarf with Trick, to render the Pokemon that you're using Trick on practically useless, which is particularly great against stall teams. However, that doesn't always need to be the case, since Scarf Rotom without using Trick is also very valuable. Since its 86 base speed stat isn't very impressive, but with the Scarf, it outspeeds the majority of the metagame. With Scarf, it becomes a good revenge sweeper and can take out the majority of water types in the tier via Thunderbolt, like Gyarados, Suicune, and Empoleon. He would often run moves like Thunder, Thunderbolt, Will-O-Wisp, Hydro Pump, and Shadow Ball in the hidden powers. Along with Flygon and Tyranitar, these are the best revenge killers in the tier. Also, you should probably subscribe, because if you don't, the only Pokemon that will get a Mega in the next game is Mewtwo. I know, because Junichi Masuda is actually my uncle. The family resemblance is uncanny. Next, Generation 5, a generation defined by weather, controversial bans, and Doryuzu. First off, Landorus, who is definitely considered probably the best Scarfer of all time. Now, just based off how consistent, it's literally the go-to item for Landorus, even still in Generation 9. In Generation 5 specifically, Lando, just like Flygon, has access to U-turn, which means that he can pivot out of Pokemon that potentially wall him, like Corviknight. It was also great against other common threats, like Reuniclus, Latias, Alakazam, Celebi. It might seem like this set is just Landorus spamming stab and super effective attacks left and right, and that is kind of what it is, but in its defense, it's a very effective strategy. This variant also synergizes very well with Tyranitar, so it fits very well in sand teams. It's the best offensive pivot in the whole tier, and this is reflected in the fact that Scarf Lando is the most common version of it. Scarf combined with Intimidate also synergizes very well, since Pokemon like Dragonite and Garchomp are forced to switch out to get rid of that. And since he has an immune to spikes, he can continue to spam attacks, most notably U-turn, for as long as you need him to. Keldeo, another mythical. Along with Specs, Scarf was a top-notch set for Keldeo. He already had a very impressive speed stat for Gen 5 OU, but with Scarf he would outspeed would-be faster Pokemon like Gengar, Latias, and Terrakion. With a great stab typing of water and fighting, just like Landorus, he's pretty much set for spamming attacks. He's pretty much graded for spamming attacks. His moveset usually consists of Sacred Sword, Hydro Pump, Scald, the hidden powers, and usually electric and ice, and he was very menacing with a timid nature. With a timid nature, he can outspeed other choice Scarfers like Garchomp and other Kildeos. It was a really great threat to Pokemon like Gliscor, Salamence, and Landorus if it was running in Power Ice as well. Excadrill. Generation 5 was a great generation for ground types, wow. And for a while, Excadrill was even banned to Ubers, but now he's running rampant in Generation 5, since his ability that made him overpowered is now banned. So you can use him right now if you want. Excadrill's speed stat is not bad, it's 88, but many Pokemon outspeed him. That's really one of the only flaws that he has. However, with Choice Scarf, Excadrill is now probably top 3 strongest Pokemon in the tier. This pairs very well with Mold Breaker because of how it allows it to completely OHKO one of the would-be best Excadrill counters. Rotom Wash, that is. Hydreigon. Hydreigon is a great Pokemon who is unfortunately only OU in its debut generation. It was incredible here with a great stat typing of Dark and Dragon and an amazing special stat of 125. I'll be honest, I don't hear much about Scarfed Hydreigon because the Specs version is very popular, but I wanted to talk about the Scarfed version. Now, as you know, the benchmark for a fast Pokemon is 100, and he is a little bit short of that by 2 points. Fortunately, Scarf will let you outspeed using Draco Meteors or Dark Pulses on everyone. Which, by the way, at this point, Draco Meteor is a 140 base power move, since this was before it was nerfed. Scarf helps it outspeed non-Scarf threats like Garchomp and Latias that would OHKO it normally with its super effective dragon attacks. It has great coverage. Besides those 2 moves, it also would run Fire Blast, Focus Blast, Roost, and the hidden powers. Garchomp. Garchomp has finally been unbanned at this point and is allowed in OU. I talked a lot about Landorus and Excadrill. I definitely think that Garchomp is the best Pokemon in Generation 5 OU in my opinion. It's the best revenge killer in the format with the speed stat that at this point is considered top tier, with one of the best attack stats in the tier, and is tied for the 3rd strongest Outrage. Scarfed Outrage is particularly very powerful, since it can outspeed and OHKO every dragon type in the tier, including the Loggy Twins. And although this video is about the OU tier specifically, I don't know if I said that, but I'm saying it now, Scarfed Garchomp was also a reliable choice in Uber since it could revenge kill Rayquaza, for example. It also has access to Rock Slide, which is great to deal with She Who Will Not Be Named, and he's also half of the Dragmax strategy, which is a staple of Gen 5 OU, which is where Magneton lures in Steel types and Garchomp gently massacres them. Overall, a great generation for choice Scarfers, very chaotic. Generation 6, my personal favorite generation, and the one that got me into competitive Pokemon. Also introduced the 3D sprites, which disappointed everyone. I think some of them were cool. I think some of you guys are just a little bit mean, but whatever. Anyways, Scarfed Magneton. That was a thing that I didn't really remember because Magneton is not necessarily a Pokemon that you think is worth of using a choice scarf on because of how slow it is. But a jolly-natured Magneton gets a speed stat as fast as 360, which isn't bad at all. He has access to one of the best moves a choice scarfer could have, or really anyone could have, in Volt Switch. On top of that, along with Magnet Pull, it can now not only trap, but outspeed opposing steel types like Bisharp, Jirachi, and Scizor. Besides that, it would also run Flash Cannon, Thunderbolt, and the hidden powers. Overall, even though Magneton was a very versatile Pokemon who could run multiple items like Air Balloon and Specs, Scarf would make him a great lane sweeper. RIP Magneton, I haven't heard about him in a very long time. Heatran. I could have also mentioned this for Generation 4, but I thought it would be more fitting here, I don't know why. Heatran is a very versatile Pokemon who ran pretty much any item in existence. Air Balloon, Specs, Leftovers, and of course, Choice Scarf. Scarf took full advantage of its offensive capabilities, both special and physical, where he would usually run sets like Overheat, the hidden powers, Flash Cannon, Earth Power, and Stone Edge. Simply put, there's not many Pokemon that can handle an Overheat from Heatran. It's just really, really powerful. The only thing that could make him better was a moveset-wise would be Volt Switch at this point. And more importantly, a jolly-natured Scarf Heatran outspeeds even a Mega Lopunny. Kyurem Black, the bane of my existence, this thing is a very good choice Scarfer, and probably the best wall breaker in the tier, with its huge attack stats higher than Groudon and Koraidon. Let me repeat that, it's higher than Koraidon's. He has a great bulk as well, as he is not easily OHKO'd from even super effective attacks, and unlike other offensive behemoths with high attack stats like Melmetal, Kyurem Black wasn't even slow, he just didn't necessarily pass the benchmark for a fast Pokemon. He would usually run Ice Beam, Outrage, Fusion Bolt, Earth Power, Iron Head, and Dragon Claw. Unfortunately, he has no good physical Ice type move, unlike Wooper that is. Who has to watch out for him, you ask? Well, pretty much everyone. He has almost no straightforward switch-ins. I guess you could try Ferrothorn. Good luck, do your best. Ditto. I didn't know where to put Ditto, so he's going here. Ditto is really interesting, I suppose. Ditto can replicate everything, as you know, except for the HP stat. Scarf Ditto basically makes a very good revenge killer because you're guaranteed to always outspeed because he even copies your boosts. But some might also call it a bit unreliable. I don't know what to say because it's painfully straightforward, but every time a new generation comes out, Ditto becomes one of the most popular Pokemon because people don't yet 100% know what teams are the most viable to use. So Ditto's a good choice in order to scope out the competition. Unfortunately, once time passes and people are more familiar with the metagame, Ditto's usage plummets since you no longer need him. Now on to Generation 7, Kartana. Kartana is one of the most menacing Pokemon in the tier, and I think that's maybe it has something to do with that 181 attack stat in Generation 7. It has the third highest attack stat in the whole game in Generation 8, and then Generation 8 it has the highest attack stat, period. He's not in Generation 9, but he would have had the highest attack stat again in that generation. So he doesn't necessarily need a choice band, but what could make him better? A choice scarf. Simply put, there is not another choice scarfer that's going to hit as hard as him. There's not much that can switch into a stab leaf blade off of a 181 attack stat. And those who can are usually steel types that have to watch out for his sacred sword. Alongside Smart Strike and Knockoff, its move pool is pretty okay, honestly. It's not amazing, but it's good enough. He also has Deep Fog, which I've never actually seen anyone use it because he's very frail, but you can. And with the Scarfed Jolly Natured Kartana, he has a speed stat up to 552, which is pretty intimidating combined with that power. Next is Tapu Lele. Tapu Lele is one of the most popular wall breakers in the tier. Tapu Lele is very versatile, running items like Twisted Spoon Specs and obviously Scarf. She's incredibly vital to offensive teams because while obviously Psychic Terrain plus Psychic plus Moonblast plus Focus Blast is menacing to literally 95% of Pokemon, it's her access to Psyshock and therefore breaking through Blissey that makes her incredibly valuable. However, her speed stat is of 95, which isn't bad, it's just not exceptional. With the Scarf though, she can outspeed a choice Scarf Lando, Keldeo, and Megalatias, practically almost everyone. She became incredibly dangerous with this item since her move pool is already incredibly menacing, access to the moves that I mentioned. In short, it's very fast and either OHKOs or 2-hit KOs everything in sight. Victini. So I don't really like Victini just because I find her annoying. That being said, it's a great Pokemon and an even better choice Scarfer. Victini has an amazing move pool, and Scarf Victini usually runs U-Turn, V-Crate, Final Gambit, Bolt Strike, and Zen Headbutt. With the very menacing and diverse move pool, she's an absolute threat to Pokemon like Tapu Lele, Ferrothorn, Tyranitar, Magnera, but like every legendary or mythical, I don't even know what they're called, it has 100 base stats all across the board. Now, as the years have went on, that became more and more unviable and painfully average, but at this time it was pretty impressive. And at the very least, that means she has a 100 base speed stat, which is great. That makes her a pretty good candidate for Choice Scarf. And Choice Scarf makes her a great revenge killer since she can outspeed Pokemon like Kartana, Blacephalon, Mega Diancie, and Mega Lopunny. Overall, a great chaotic, destructive Pokemon. Greninja. Greninja, specifically Protein Greninja, is a great candidate with Choice Scarf, similarly to Victini, who is just chaotically destructive, as I said. Greninja in its prime was arguably the top Pokemon in Gen 7 OU, and while I've used the word versatile to describe lots of Pokemon so far, he really is the definition. Greninja's ability to have stab on literally every move, and the fact that it has kind of an infinite amount of move pools like Hydro Pump, Dark Pulse, Gunk Shot, Rock Slide, Spikes, Ice Beam, Low Kick, U-Turn, Extra Sensory, and the Hidden Powers, made it a very dangerous Pokemon. And honestly, you might think that the Scarf is rather unnecessary, an overkill on an item with a 122 base speed stat. And while in a certain sense you're right, as a lot of people chose to run Specs instead of Scarf, he's not the fastest Pokemon in the tier, as Pokemon like Mega Alakazam and Tapu Koko. However, with Scarf, you can nullify that. And on top of that, you can use U-Turn to pivot out. Blacephalon. This sleep paralysis demon of Pokemon has a great stab combination of Ghost and Fire. Blacephalon has two very high attack stats that are very rarely seen in competitive Pokemon, and it's one of the best revenge killers in the tier. She would usually run moves like Fire Blast, Shadow Ball, Mind Blown, where it literally decapitates itself and kills itself by exploding, Hidden Powers, Flamethrower, Trick, Dark Pulse, Psychic Overheat, and Psyshock. Just like Tapu Lele, it's a very strong special attacker, but via Psyshock, it sets itself apart because it's able to be chancy. But arguably, Blacephalon has a better offensive typing, and she was just kind of a nightmare of a Pokemon. Generation 8, which in my opinion, I feel like the amount of choice Scarfers were kind of lackluster in this gen. Urshifu Rapid Strike, a very customizable Pokemon. Usually running Surging Strikes, U-Turn Close Combat, Aqua Jet, and Ice Punch. He's one of the best Scarfers and Wall Breaker, with its ability to literally break through Protect, and has one of the most bailable moves in the tier with Surging Strikes. It also has access to U-Turn, and with Scarf, it can outspeed the majority of the metagame, since the only thing underwhelming about it is his speed stat, if you could even say it's underwhelming. He's really only been being outsped at this point by other choice Scarfers. This turns him into an arguably the best pivot in the entire game. He's also a great Pokemon to pair with Galarian Slowbro, as its iconic Future Sight with its iconic future sight in order to decimate Toxapex and its other stall friends. Next is Tapu Fini. He's by far the most defensively oriented Scarfer in the tier, and that's partly because of its typing. Water Fairies is a good offensive typing, but I would say it's definitely a better defensive typing as well. It will usually run moves like Moonblast, Scald, Draining Kiss, Taunt, Defog. While she is sort of in the same boat as Tyranitar and Magneton, in the sense that it's not super fast, so you wouldn't automatically think of using a Choice Scarf on it, and also because she has a lot of other bulkier builds, including Leftovers, you wouldn't think to scarf her. Scarf sets can potentially be a really good mix of offensive moves and utility moves that prevents Pokemon from setting up and crippling it via moves like Toxic. Overall, a good Pokemon. Now for our current generation, Generation 9. First is Enamorus. I think we all know by this point, Enamorus is a very excellent revenge killer with the bulk of a cast form, but he's the second best offensive fairy type in the tier, usually running Moonblast, Mystical Fire, Terra Blast, Healing Wish, Earth Power, and Close Combat, outspeeding Zamazenta, Cinderace, Dragapult, Iron Moth, Meowscarada, Roaring Moon, and Walking Wake. Once Enamorus is on the field, there's not going to be that much that can stop it from sniping out the competition. And although I feel like the Stellar type was overall kind of disappointing and overall more of a footnote, Stellar goes well with Enamorus for its simple reason that you don't have to worry about resists, since it hits everything for neutral damage. You just have to make sure that he gets the proper support and that hazards are off the field. Goldigo, my arch nemesis, the reason I drink. I don't like this Pokemon, but it's a good choice Scarfer. This Pokemon is not easy to deal with, as it has one of the most overpowered abilities in my opinion, alongside one of the most annoying defensive typings. It takes so long to get this thing off the field, decent speed, and powerful moves. You're almost never going to OHKO this thing, and it's probably the best revenge killer of Generation 9, as he threatens the most prominent Pokemon in the tier like Enamorus, Kyurem, Primarina, Dragapult, and he fits pretty much on any team from Hyper Offense to Bulky Offense to Balance. Next is Meowscarada. Meowscarada is one of the best Scarfers and pivots, with access to U-Turn, Triple Axle, Flower Trick, Low Kick, and Knockoff. It's literally menacing to almost everyone not named Skarvery or Corviknight. It already has one of the best speed stat in the tier, but this way it's able to outspeed Darkrai, Dragapult, Zamazenta, and overall great for spamming Knockoff. However, much like Enamorus, while it's a good teammate, it needs that support to back it up because it's overall frailty. Speaking of frail dark types, Darkrai, a common Focus Sash Pokemon, but Focus Sash sucks, and we're not here for that. He's very similar to Meowscarada in the sense that he's a good revenge killer that needs support and cannot handle hazards, but it's tied for the 4th highest speed stat. So once he has a Scarf, almost nothing can outspeed it. It has access to Dark Pulse, Sludge Bomb, Focus Blast, Ice Beam, and most sets straight up just don't run Dark Void because it's not worth it, but you can if you want to. It's pretty good because it has a move pool that threatens other revenge killers themselves, like Iron Valiant, Enamorus, and Goldengo. So that's my list for what I personally think are some of the most iconic and important choice Scarfers. Some Scarfers that I didn't talk about but I do want to mention were 1. Jirachi, who I didn't mention because I feel like her Leftovers, Thunder Wave, Iron Head sets are much more iconic, but you could indeed scarf her. I also wanted to talk about Infernape, sometimes did run Scarf, but was most prominently a Life Orb user. Anyways, that's all for the list of the most important choice Scarfers in competitive Pokemon history in my opinion. I'm sure there's others that I didn't mention, but these are the ones that I think were personally the most important.